Detention, a call to reform. My name is Linda Rosen, and I'm a program manager with the Innovation and Research Division at OJJDP. Preventing, intervening, and treating trafficking victims using appropriate trauma-informed practices is a priority for the Attorney General, Eric Holder, as well as for OJJDP Administrator Robert Listenby. Human trafficking is a crime and a human rights abuse that is a form of modern-day slavery. Girls are particularly vulnerable to this form of abuse. OJJDP efforts on behalf of young trafficking victims include support for the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, the National Girls Institute, Internet Crimes Against Children Task Forces, community awareness projects, law enforcement-focused projects, mentoring, victim resources for child victims of sex trafficking, and research projects to study the prevalence of commercial sex exploitation of children. Trafficked girls experience serious trauma. OJJDP is taking action to provide guidance, training, and technical assistance for law enforcement, judges, and other system-involved stakeholders to address the needs of trafficked girls and keep them from entering the juvenile justice system. We're happy that you've joined us for today's webinar. Today's presentation will feature Malika Sadasar, who is Executive Director, and Yasmin Vafa, who is Director of Law and Policy at Rights for Girls. Dr. Angie Wolf from our National Girls Institute will serve as moderator. It's our goal that some of the information shared with you today will resonate and assist you to continue the important work of identifying victimization and providing gender-appropriate trauma-informed services for young women. We'll begin our webinar in just a few minutes, but at this time I'd like to hear from Andrea Massengill from the OJJDP National Training and Technical Assistance Center to share a few features of Adobe.
Thank you for joining us today. As your host, I would like to take a couple minutes to discuss a few features of Adobe Connect. To view the bios and photos of the presentation panel, please access the Word document, which is available now in the upper right section of your webinar dashboard. The PowerPoint and resource handouts are also located there for you to access. There will be a Q&A segment throughout the presentation today. As questions arise, please send them to me, your host, to share with the panelists by using the chat feature. To use the chat feature, please direct your attention to the bottom of the PowerPoint screen to the right of the PowerPoint. Type the question in the chat box and press the conversation bubble to the right of the chat box. During that time, we will take every opportunity to address some of the questions you have posed during the presentation. For those of you participating in today's webinar as a group, please take a minute and help us count. Go to the chat window and type in the name of the person registered and the total number of additional people in the room with you today. This will help us with our final count. Again, if you're viewing with a larger group, please type in the name of the person registered and the number of additional people joining you today. At the conclusion of today's webinar, you will be provided with a link to take a 5-minute online survey about today's presentation. We appreciate your feedback regarding the webinar, and this information is used to assist OJJDP in future planning and training. You will be able to access the link on the last slide of the PowerPoint. For those of you participating as a group member, please enter the link on the last slide in your web browser to share your feedback. Again, thank you for joining us today. And now I will turn it back over to Linda. Today's webinar will be moderated by Angie Wolf, Director of the National Girls Institute, as well as the Associate Director of Research at the National Council on Crime and Delinquency. Angie has more than 15 years of experience in community-based program evaluation and public policy research, and has directed research and program work on female offenders, gang violence, child exposed to trauma, intimate partner violence, and offender treatment programs. She has authored peer-reviewed journal articles, book chapters, and other publications on juvenile offending, domestic violence, and the development of gender-specific research and services for girls and women involved with the juvenile and criminal justice system. So now let's get started. Angie?
Hi, I think we're having a slight audio issue with Angie Wolf's audio. This is Caroline Glessman, also with the National Girls Institute and the National Council on Crime and Delinquency. So I'll go ahead and introduce the National Girls Institute, and then we'll go ahead and introduce our presenters. So this is the third webinar conducted by the National Girls Institute. NGI is a federally funded partnership between the National Council on Crime and Delinquency and the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. NGI is a research-based training and resource clearinghouse designed to advance understanding of girls' issues and improve program and system responses to girls in the juvenile justice system. NGI provides direction for advancing the application of research and information to practice to improve national, state, and local responses to girls, and assists agencies to improve capacity by providing training and technical assistance along the entire continuum of services to better meet the needs of girls and staff who work with them. So one of the ways we do that is by conducting webinars. We've conducted 2 webinars to date on trauma-informed care by Stephanie Covington and a gender-responsive behavior modification system by Kim Selvaggi. So those are available in the NTTAC archives. We're excited to present today's webinar on child trafficking, girls, and detention, a call to reform, conducted by our colleagues from Rights for Girls, a human rights organization focused on gender-based violence and its impact on vulnerable young women and girls in the U.S. Our 2 presenters today are Malika Sadasar and Yasmin Vafa. Malika is the Rights for Girls Executive Director. She's also co-founder of the Rebecca Project for Human Rights, a policy and advocacy organization for vulnerable women and families, where she led the effort to shut down Craigslist sex ads, which served as the leading site for the trafficking of children for sex, and also ended the federal practice of shackling pregnant mothers behind bars in U.S. prisons. Yasmin Vafa directs the policy, strategy, and legislative agenda of Rights for Girls. Her work focuses on analyzing and drafting proposed legislation, developing campaigns and advocacy initiatives, producing policy recommendations and briefs, and advising policymakers throughout the legislative process on issues affecting vulnerable young women and girls in the U.S. So the three objectives of today's webinar are, first, to recognize that in many states, victims of domestic child sex trafficking are being arrested and detained for juvenile prostitution-related status offenses. Second, to understand why child sex trafficking victims require trauma-informed, gender-specific services instead of being subject to conditions of confinement that exacerbate their existing trauma. And third, to learn how juvenile justice facility staff can begin to identify and assess for commercial sexual exploitation and trafficking within existing caseloads so they can connect these youth with vital services and interventions. So now I'd like to turn it over to Malika.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I apologize for some of the challenges that we are having, but it is good to be a group together and especially look at this very, very critical intersection between the issue of girls who are being trafficked and girls who are at risk and involved in our juvenile justice system. So let's look at this issue first. Let's have a landscape of how we see the intersection between child trafficking and girls behind bars. So first, a couple of important words that need to be lifted up here. In the work that we do, we talk about this as domestic child sex trafficking, but we also have terms like domestic minor sex trafficking and the commercial sexual exploitation of children, which refer to this issue of trafficking and exploitation. And what is important about how we are framing this issue is that we are framing it within the U.S., that when we look at the issue of domestic child trafficking, it is estimated by DOJ that we have between 100 to 300,000 American children at risk of being trafficked and exploited. The majority of those children are girls, and that they are forced into being trafficked and exploited between the ages of 12 to 14. in terms of looking at the law and how domestic child trafficking is defined by statute, the most important piece of trafficking legislation that we have is the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, what is also known as the TVPA. And within the TVPA, there is contemplation and defining of domestic child sex trafficking to be the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for the purposes of a commercial sex act where the victim is a U.S. citizen or lawful permanent resident under the age of 18. And what's also important to note is that the definition is not limited to the selling of children through prostitution. Other important facts here in order to paint the picture as an American crisis is that we know, according to the FBI, that between 2008 to 2010, 83% of confirmed sex trafficking victims in the U.S. were in fact U.S. citizens. 40% of those cases involved the trafficking of children. And so why do we see this playing out at these levels and these numbers? Part of why we see the issue of domestic child trafficking at a more crisis level is because of the emergence of the internet. So because of the internet, we have these very mainstream legitimate sites like Backpage.com and previously Craigslist, where an individual with full discretion, anonymity, can purchase a child for sex. And that purchase of an underage girl is as easy as going to another part of the site and buying a bike, right? So this way in which a person doesn't have to go to a salacious website, but something as normative as Backpage.com and be able to purchase a child for sex is part of the reason why we see this type of demand for children for sex. The other piece is that we also see a way that the emergence of the internet has converged with how gangs and organized crime have recognized that it is cheaper, less risky, more profitable for them to be able to sell girls than drugs, right? And so if you look at how drugs have been sold throughout the U.S. by gangs and organized crime, those drug routes have been repurposed to sell girls because there's the recognition that we don't have a culture of crime and punishment around the selling of girls as we do have with the selling of drugs. And so those are part of the contributory reasons why we see more and more very vulnerable girls being bought and sold for sex. Who are these girls? What we want to do here is allow girl survivors themselves to speak to who they are and what their own journeys have been. And so this is an opportunity, thanks to many different organizations and directors who have been able to give a platform and voice to these girl survivors to tell their own stories. We are going to show the Human Trafficking in America Child Sex Trafficking video now.
I just thought I was so madly in love with him, and he just made me feel safe. Like, you know, I didn't have a dad figure, so he I just thought I was so madly in love with him, and he just made me feel safe. Like, you know, I didn't have a dad figure, so he became my dad, and like, I loved him too. Average was $1,500 a night, and if I didn't get it, He'd take wooden bats, hit me, lamps, anything he could pick up and hit me with, he'd do it. I thought he loved me, and then he turns around and beat me. 12 other girls in our house. Yeah. So I call him Daddy Daycare. Like, it's a daycare center. You just can't get up and leave. Like, y'all can get up and go for work. It's just like you can't get up and leave. Like, he had threatened me about my family. He knew where I lived, you know. So it was like I was afraid of him getting hurt. So I just stayed.
Instantly fell in love with him. He knew that I didn't have a dad. I didn't have a daddy. Used that in order to gain control over my mind and eventually my actions, showing me that he loved me and giving me things that I had never had before. They move you away from your family. They move you away from anybody who could care for you or rescue you, or even see that perhaps you're in a bad situation. And they completely engage you in what's called the game or the life, so that things that would make other people's skin crawl turn out to be normal occurrences to you. And at that point, you are completely dominated by this person. You do belong to this person. I knew I was in a situation that I was not in control of. I knew I was in a situation where I was being exploited, where I was being beat, where I was being raped, where I was being tortured for the commercial gain of another human being. I was definitely not free. That is not a situation where one is free.
The crux of my childhood growing up was that my parents didn't love me. The specifics include physical, sexual, and emotional abuse. My parents trafficking me and selling me for sex. The official trafficking began when I was 10. My parents had already terrified me, so I wasn't going to directly tell somebody, because if I got caught, then I didn't know what was going to happen to me. I remember in the 3rd grade, I wrote my teacher a letter, and I didn't say explicitly that they were abusing me, but I said, you know, I don't know if I'm going to make it to the 3rd grade and 4th grade and 5th grade and 6th grade and 7th and 8th and 9th and 10th and 11th and 12th. And I wrote every grade out, and I said, I don't know if I can do it. I don't know if I'm going to make it. And I remember she chuckled because I was this straight-A student, and she was taking it as if I meant I'm not going to succeed or something.
I was 13 or 14. We went to his mother's house, and the two women that he had with him in the car when he picked me up began to prep me for what was to come. The older girl, she kind of walked me through how it would go, what I was supposed to do with the money, when I was supposed to get the money, how much I was supposed to charge, and what to expect, and told me that I should have a lot of alcohol in me, that it may be hard, but that it would get easier, and I did that. I was shaped like a boy, very stringy, very thin, very underdeveloped. It flabbergasts me that it was okay, you know, that the people who were coming to buy us, the Johns, if you will, that they knew that I was a child.
I was recruited into sexual exploitation at the age of 10 years old. He provided a lot of attention. He seemed like he was very courteous and sweet. He wanted me to have a good time. He told me he wanted me to dress in the flyest clothes. He wanted me to have the best things. A lot of the things that people, you know, call selling a dream, that's what I got. Things I thought were going to be good with him. But it didn't take me long to realize that he was a very violent person. He was addicted to crack cocaine. He snorted all day long. So I learned early that he needed to have his drug money or my face was going to be in the wall. So I feel the most difficult part of my victimization was the sense of hopelessness. I feel that.
So again, I apologize that not all of the video was able to be heard. This is video that is available on YouTube, and I know that there's going to be an effort made here to ensure that folks can receive the video and be able to bear witness to the perspectives given here of the survivors and be able to honor their experience and their voice. When we talk about who the girls are, I want to pull back for a second and share with you that a couple of years ago, before we had started to do the work around domestic child trafficking, I was working on a white paper that was to map out how girls who were at risk of being juvenile justice involved carried with them histories of sexual violence. And what I was trying to do was map out how we talk about the cradle to prison pipeline or the school to prison pipeline for boys, but that really what the girl's story was that of the sexual violence to prison pipeline. And so I wanted to do focus groups with girls who were already behind bars or had formerly been detained, for them to share their own experiences and to also do an analysis of how all of them really had these very serious, extensive histories of sexual violence. And their way of coping with that sexual violence was to run away from home or to be truant, and those actions rendered them vulnerable then to juvenile justice involvement because they would be picked up on the status offense of running away or loitering. So that was the story, that was the paper that I intended to write out. And in the focus groups that I did, and these were focus groups all over the country with these girls who had been JJ involved, what became very clear is that many of them were behind bars or had been put behind bars for child prostitution, or in their conversations with me, they had disclosed that they had been bought and sold. So maybe they weren't detained for child prostitution, but they were detained on a status offense related to the fact that they had been trafficked and exploited. And I think that that experience really raised up the intersection of juvenile justice girls and the issue of child trafficking and made clear to me that this is the same girl. And when we look at this slide in terms of the profile of who the girls are, we see that, yes, they're involved in the juvenile justice system, that many of them are runaways, that we have 450,000 children who run away every year, and a third of them will be lured into exploitation and trafficking within 48 hours. And if we look also at the slide that gives the profile of the age, right, between the age of 12 to 14, although my slide's not working, well, that the age is between 12 and 14 of a girl who is sexually exploited, that they carry with them these very severe histories of sexual abuse, physical abuse, neglect, child welfare involved in neighborhoods so often that are with failed school systems and economically suffering. That is the profile also, right, of the girl who is JJ involved. And so often it is not only the intersection, it is the same girl, the girl who runs away from an abusive home or foster care placement and then is criminalized for running away with a status offense, is the same girl who at the bus stop or the foster care group home or the runaway shelter is coerced by a trafficker, by an exploiter. So I think it's important to show that it is an intersection, that it is about the same girl, and that these factors that make girls so vulnerable to being exploited and to being trafficked, where you have individuals who appear to these girls when they are runaways, when they are in and out of the juvenile justice system, these individuals appear to them as boyfriends, as individuals who promise to take care of them, promise to keep them safe, and then ultimately are in the situation of exploiting them. I'm trying to move to the next slide, but it's not working for me. Okay, so here we have some of the stats that look at the intersection between sexual abuse and vulnerability to being bought and sold, to being trafficked. Especially looking at the West Coast Children's Clinic in Oakland showed in 2012 that over 75% of CSEC victims in the study also experienced child abuse and neglect. All right, so we're moving from really trying to uncover the intersection between children who are exploited, girls who are bought and sold, and the juvenile justice system. And here we want to move forward and look at the intersection between child welfare and child trafficking. Just like with the juvenile justice system, there is not a systematic identification and assessment of children who are subject to being bought and sold, children who are exploited and trafficked. We also don't have that type of data within the child welfare system. We don't have that same type of systematic identification and assessment for CSEC. Oh, okay. In some states, though, there has been that effort to be able to identify and assess children who come to the attention of child welfare who have also been trafficked. So Connecticut has done some really remarkable work around this. In 2012, we saw that they identified 88 child victims of trafficking and 86 were child welfare involved, and most reported abuse while in foster care or residential placement. In New York, 2007, identified 2,250 child victims of trafficking. 75% of them had come into contact with the child welfare system. In Alameda, a one-year review of local CSEC victims found that 55% were from foster youth group homes and 82% had previously run away from homes multiple times. San Diego, between 80 to 95% of child victims of trafficking and exploitation had child welfare involvement, and that many of these youth had multiple child welfare referrals, and in most instances, the initial referrals took place at the age of 7. In Florida, same story, where the FBI identified 70% of victims in Florida as foster youth. So part of this intersection that we want to raise and frame here is one that I think the survivors give best voice to. And there's a quote here from T, who you also saw in the documentary, T. Ortiz Walker Pettigrew. And she has very powerfully talked about how, for her, foster care was the training ground for being bought and sold. And she talks about how she understood very early on, being essentially born into the foster care system, and in those different multiple placements of foster care homes, being abused in most of them. She understood then that there was a real duality between being cared for and being raped. And she also understood that she was attached to a paycheck. And because of that, because of those experiences, it made sense to her. She talks about it also as a seamless transition going from foster care to being trafficked and exploited. And what she's also remarked on, which is not in this quote, is that at least when the exploiter or the pimp appeared, at least he claimed to love her. And she, in all those different foster care those different foster care placements, rarely heard that she was loved, did not feel that she was claimed. But that exploiter, when he approached her, was purposeful about saying that he loved her and claiming her. And that is such a vulnerability for so many child welfare children, especially those who have been subject to multiple placements, and certainly those who have been subject to sexual abuse in those different placements. Now, again, this is not to frame foster care as being a situation where children are always abused or that foster care parents are predatory individuals. I think we recognize that it's a far more complex situation than that. But what we must give attention to is how girls who are bought and sold are such a manifestation of how broken our foster care system is. And that when these girls go through multiple placements, develop attachment disorder, go through issues of severe abuse, they are then so vulnerable to being trafficked. And certainly the numbers that we have give voice to that. This is another very powerful quote from a survivor named Tina, who speaks to that same way in which foster care was a training ground for being subject to commercial sexual exploitation. I want to share another piece here where Rights for Girls had done a survivor workshop in Congress, where we brought together a number of girls to give voice to their experiences of having survived. And they were on the inside. It was about 10 girls who were in the fishbowl, and on the outside were lawmakers and policymakers. And each girl stood up and powerfully shared her survivor story. And what every single girl spoke to was how they had been essentially born into foster care, subject to multiple placements, and abused in many of those different placements, and how that place of abuse rendered them so vulnerable to the exploiters. So again, there's a real need for more identification and assessment across the child welfare agencies in every state. We only see some really innovative efforts being done at the county level or the state level, but it's so needed that we do this in a more systematic manner so that we understand the intersection more deeply. And part of what plays out here is that even though I think we could all agree that child sex trafficking is absolutely a form of child sex abuse, most child welfare agencies will not intervene in these cases because it is not usually a parent or caretaker who is committing the abuse. It is usually not the parent or caretaker who is in fact the exploiter. And so more often than not, these cases of domestic child trafficking are referred to law enforcement and are not claimed by the child welfare agency or advocacy community. Unfortunately, though, when child welfare is not the source of referral and intervention, when law enforcement is, too often we have situations where it is the girls, the underage girls, who are put behind bars, who are detained, who are arrested for being bought and sold. And we have these examples of just in Los Angeles, California, where girls who were being trafficked at the point of interaction with law enforcement, it was the girls and not the so-called John or buyer who was arrested, but the girls. Now, compare that to what happens if it were a child welfare scenario. So let me share with you a situation that played out 2 years ago in Trenton. There was a terrible case in Trenton where an older sister took her younger sister, held her hostage in a room, and then brought all of these men and boys in the apartment building to line up and pay the older sister to go in and rape the younger sister. Law enforcement was called. Law enforcement immediately recognized that this was a situation of child sexual abuse, put the child into the child welfare referral system, made sure that she was seen as a victim and cared for as such, arrested the men and boys on child statutory rape, child endangerment, sexual assault of a minor. Now, compare that to a situation in which the older sister instead is a pimp who is selling the girl on Backpage. Most likely, when law enforcement intervenes in that kind of scenario, the response is to arrest the girl victim and to not see the situation as that of child sexual abuse. And that is part of how we have to move and shift the paradigm, that any time law enforcement comes into contact with a situation of child trafficking, whether the child is trafficked by a parent or by an exploiter who is not a family member, that the response of law enforcement is to bring that child into the child welfare system and get the support and services afforded to that child through child welfare, and also arrest those individuals who are selling and buying the child. And that is the kind of protocol that we are seeking, and that is part of how we end the criminalization of girls who are being subject to child trafficking and exploitation. That we call for protocol that really pulls the child in the situation into the child welfare system as opposed to routing her through the juvenile justice system. And that we also see collaboration, right, with child advocacy centers that are equipped to deal with issues and instances and scenarios of child sexual abuse. And that there also be collaboration with rape crisis centers, sexual assault coalitions, so that we really begin to understand in practice that these girls are not bad girls making bad decisions, that they are not criminals who ought to be put behind bars, that these girls are victims of child abuse, of child sexual abuse, and ought to be afforded all of the services, treatment opportunities that any other girl who is a victim of child sexual abuse ought to be afforded. I think now we'll go to some questions.
Yes, this is Caroline with the National Girls Institute. Thanks so much, Malika. Yes, we've received a number of questions. We've had a very active chat box. It's great to see so much networking and information sharing going on. So I think some of the questions that have come up have already been answered in the chat box, but let's move to a few others that I think are still open. So the first question for you, Malika and Yasmin, is what do we do when we believe girls have been involved in trafficking, but they don't think so?
It's a wonderful question. Well, first, I think it's important to honor the girl's experience, right? I mean, girls need to be approached from a place that is strength-based and honoring, because too much of how they have been treated throughout their lives is without that honor and without that place of giving them strength. So I think that's always the starting point. And then I think it's important to be able to engage with the girl through one's own conversations, but also in conversations with other survivors, to be able to talk about her experience and to be able to see it as an experience that is that where there was not necessarily agency that she had as a 12-year-old or as a 13-year-old, and that recognizing that that place of being exploited and trafficked does not mean that she has to see herself as a victim, as a girl who's not strong, but to understand that what has happened to her was a crime and that she deserves all the opportunities for support as an individual who has endured that crime. I do think, though, that what is so important is to honor the girl, to connect that girl to other survivors so that she may bear witness to the stories and experiences of other survivors. And then I think any time a young woman, a girl, is put into a place of receiving trauma-informed services, that place of learning her own story and how she has been hurt, but also that she has power, is available. And that's why we talk so much about how these girls ought to be in situations of trauma-informed treatment. It is the work of the Human Rights Project for Girls to spend every day on the Hill arguing for more federal funding for treatment facilities for these girls, because they deserve an opportunity to have trauma-informed care where they can come to their own places of self-awareness and discovery and healing.
Great. Thank you so much, Malika. Our next question is, we've had a number of questions about how various types of providers and sectors can be a part of this issue. So what can schools or school districts do to help learn about and decrease child trafficking?
You know, it's fascinating. So many of the girl survivors whom we've had the honor of meeting and working with have talked about if only the schools saw what they were going through. And, you know, I think this gets to the larger conversation of trauma and girls. So much of what we're talking about here today, it's really not simply a conversation around trafficking and girls, right? It's a conversation about how our juvenile justice system is failing girls. It's a conversation of how child welfare is failing girls. It's a conversation of how these girls are at the razor's edge of violence against young women and girls. And it's also a conversation of how girls who are suffering from sexual violence and trauma are invisible in our schools. That we might talk about how there are punitive school policies that are unjustly punishing children, and especially children of color. We're not having, to the same degree, though, a conversation about what does sexual abuse and trauma look like in a girl, and how does she express the trauma around it, and how can schools go through better training to be able to identify girls' experience of violence and trauma. Because I think if schools were able to do that, not only is it a way of seeing trafficking that is showing up in all of our schools in some way, but it's also an opportunity for prevention, to be able to see the girl who's being sexually abused in her home or in her foster care placement, and be able to identify that, the trauma that she feels, and intervene before the only person who's paying attention to her is the pimp.
I also think it's really important for us to raise children themselves, basically make children aware in ways that people outside of these people, for numerous cases occurs in domains, schools, and even use media such as Facebook, Instagram, as well as Twitter, in order to keep girls from normal neighborhoods. So I think awareness is also a critical component of what schools can do to help address this issue.
So Malika and Yasmin, this is Caroline. We couldn't hear the comment that I think Yasmin just made. Are you able to maybe get closer to the microphone?
Sorry, this is Yasmin. I was just saying another key component that schools can begin to implement is just awareness and letting children know how they can potentially be vulnerable to this type of exploitation. What we've heard in Virginia, right outside of DC, is that a lot of gang members and pimps have been trying to recruit children directly from schools, and also have been using different social media tactics through Facebook as well as Instagram and Twitter in order to recruit kids from middle-class neighborhoods. And so I think awareness is another key component that schools can begin to utilize in order to better prepare children and let them know that this exists in all of our communities.
Okay, great. Well, thank you both for responding to those questions. I know we have more questions. We will have another question and answer period later in the webinar, and then we'll also be able to respond to or follow up on all questions after the webinar if we're not able to get to them during this time. So now I'd like to go ahead and turn things back to Yasmin Vafa, who is the Director of Law and Policy with Rights for Girls. Yasmin, over to you.
And so moving on now to trafficking survivors' pathways into the juvenile justice system. What we know about so many American victims of child sex trafficking is that so many of them, unfortunately, do end up in the juvenile justice system, either for charges such as juvenile prostitution or for prostitution-related offenses in the form of nonviolent offenses or status offenses that are directly tied to their exploitation, but that go undetected by law enforcement, juvenile courts, as well as the juvenile justice system. To illustrate that point, Florida Department of Children and Families investigated over 1,200 cases of suspected child sex trafficking since 2010, and what they discovered was that over 700 of those cases were already involved in the juvenile justice system. And it makes sense, right? So if these kids are falling through the cracks in our child welfare system, they're falling under the radar of our schools and in our communities, it makes sense that these type of vulnerable youths would ultimately intersect with the juvenile justice system. Malika discussed a little bit about the school-to-prison pipeline, and there has been a lot of discussion of the school-to-prison pipeline. But in our work, we've really found that this is really the boys' story of juvenile justice involvement, and that for girls, it is more the sexual violence to prison pipeline. Indeed, over the last few years, there's been increasing research that indicates upwards of 70% of girls behind bars have suffered previous instances of physical and sexual abuse. Often and tragically, it's the very abuse that renders children vulnerable to juvenile justice involvement in the first place. And so, as we talked about, so many girls that we encounter behind bars indicate that they ran away from home, and they ran away from home because they were being abused. And, you know, we often routinely tell adult women to run from violence in the home, but when girls run away, they run the added risk of being involved in the juvenile justice system for the status offense of running away. Another category of youth who are also vulnerable to being criminalized for abuse and neglect that they suffer are LGBTQ youth, who are often ostracized in their communities and can also be kicked out of their homes by families. And so we often see these youth overrepresented in both our juvenile justice system as well as in our runaway and homeless youth communities. And the last instance of youth who are routinely criminalized for abuse that they suffer are, of course, victims of domestic child sex trafficking, who we know are often detained for prostitution. Turning now to prostitution, we know that most states and every state and most localities have laws that prohibit both the purchase and sale of sex acts. We know that these laws vary as to their degree of severity, and we also know that they are rarely used to go after buyers, or what we politely refer to as Johns. Prostitution statutes are, however, routinely applied to minors who engage in sex acts, and this is true despite the existence of contrary legislation in those same jurisdictions that may provide that children have to be of certain age to provide consent to sex. And we also know that trafficking survivors are also arrested and detained for status offenses or nonviolent offenses that are directly related to their exploitation. And so examples of that would be loitering in the survivor narrative that we shared earlier in the presentation, also things such as curfew violations, drug possession as well. Important to note in this instance is that 35 states currently allow for the secure detention of status offenders pursuant to a valid court order. And this is really significant as we're hearing more and more from trafficking survivors who have been detained and who are currently behind bars, that most of them are there for probation violations where the underlying offense was a status offense. Once in detention, girls are forced to navigate a system that is largely designed for boys. It is a system that is ill-equipped to address the unique needs of girls, as well as the complex trauma endured by so many of the girls that we know exist in detention. Along those same lines, juvenile court judges and detention center staff are rarely provided
basic trauma training. And so what we often hear from judges and detention center staff as well as law enforcement is that these girls are, appear very angry and aggressive and unladylike. But basic trauma training would really help inform what it is that they're actually seeing. Related to that is the fact that they're largely unaware of how traumatic the damaging impact of policies such as strip searches, the use of physical restraints, as well as the routine use of solitary confinement can be on survivors of sexual violence and trauma. Girls in detention also report sexual and physical abuse, not only by guards, but by other girls. It's no wonder that more than half of young girls behind bars have attempted to commit suicide, with 64% having attempted to do so more than once. Detention also reinforces the perception to both the community as well as these girls themselves that they are in fact delinquents, that they are bad girls making bad decisions. And this also lends to why so many of American victims of sex trafficking don't readily identify as victims of crime or as quote-unquote trafficking victims. Again, because so many of these girls have interfaced with the juvenile justice system, they've begun to really internalize the notion that they are bad girls and not at all victims of crime. Moreover, many of these children exhibit trauma bonds to their exploiters and traffickers, or what's sometimes referred to as Stockholm Syndrome, and so it is not at all uncommon to encounter a 14 or 15-year-old survivor who genuinely thinks that her 35-year-old pimp is her boyfriend. This may be the only form of child abuse where we routinely criminalize the abused child, and so it's all the more essential for the adults in the systems that these children encounter to be educated on the warning signs so as to really intervene as early as possible to connect these children with services. This leads us to a discussion on the need for improved identification and service delivery. We have a number of recommendations in this regard. The first is really more of a cultural shift, and that is shifting our lens in our communities, in our courts, and amongst law enforcement in terms of not seeing these children as delinquents or as angry or problematic youth, and really shifting our lens, and so we view them more as victims of crime. To that end, all juvenile justice systems should recognize through effective policies and procedures that children who are victims of sex trafficking ought to be viewed as victims of crime in need of services. The need for improved screening, assessment, and documentation. Currently, the lack of identification in the JJ system means that we're essentially returning these girls to the communities where they were first victimized without any services or support, and oftentimes more traumatized than when they first left. This essentially works to fuel a vicious cycle of justice involvement, and basically these girls not only end up recurring in the juvenile justice system, but also ending up in the criminal justice system later on in their lives. Another critical point to make here is that we know once girls enter the sex trade, their life expectancy falls to just 7 years, again, highlighting the critical need to identify these youth as early as possible so that we can intervene on their behalf. In terms of recommendations, juvenile justice facilities should focus on developing and implementing screening and assessment tools, not only to document those children who are currently victims of domestic child sex trafficking or commercial sexual exploitation, but also those who are at risk. These assessments should include all forms of possible abuse, including specific indicators of domestic child trafficking, and it's also really important to document the individual youth's strengths and needs and risks in order to strategize the best plan for service delivery. We've just included a couple examples of some great assessment tools here for your reference. The first is a tool developed by Shared Hope International, what they call their Intervene model, and they actually have a specialized form of this model to use in the juvenile justice context. And so the goal of this is really to improve identification and intake procedures while also using a strengths-based and trauma-informed approach. Another great example of an assessment tool is the one developed by West Coast Children's Clinic out in Alameda County, California, and they use the Child and Adolescent Needs and Strengths Assessment, or what they've dubbed the CANS SEE assessment tool, again, also strengths-based and trauma-informed approach. We also wanted to take a minute to really elevate some of the more promising programs occurring on the state and local level in terms of juvenile justice systems responding to the issue of domestic child sex trafficking. And first, we wanted to talk about what's going on in Maryland. I believe as part of the resources and handouts accessible for the webinar, you can access a 2013 statewide report from Maryland where they really outline their comprehensive effort to address the issue of domestic child sex trafficking. But for our purposes here, we particularly wanted to highlight the work being done by Maryland Department of Juvenile Services with Turnaround, Inc., which is a direct service provider based in Baltimore, Maryland, focusing on treating victims of child sex trafficking and sexual violence. And so what Turnaround and the Department of Juvenile Services did was join a partnership where they endeavored to train all DJS staff on the issue of domestic child sex trafficking, as well as on their individual assessment tool that they developed. And so they use a form of the CANS assessment tool there in Maryland, and they began to implement this tool at 2 pilot sites that were all-girls juvenile detention facilities in the state. And again, there's more information and data included in the report, but ultimately those girls who were determined to be victims were then subsequently referred to Turnaround for trauma-informed, gender-responsive services. 2 more points that I really want to touch on in terms of the work being done in Maryland. Number 1, we spoke with one of our colleagues who really helped spearhead the effort there in Maryland, and she just noted what an amazing cultural shift had taken place as a result of these efforts, not just in terms of juvenile detention staff and how they began to really view the girls that they were serving with a different lens once they were able to hear the various stories that led to these girls ending up behind bars, but also in terms of the girls and how they began to view the staff. Understandably, so many girls come into the system with a sense of hostility, distrust, and skepticism, and as a result of these efforts, it's really shifted the cultural vibes there at the juvenile detention facilities, so that really ought to be commended. One other fact that we will touch on a little bit later in the presentation is how Maryland has really taken a cross-systems approach. So what's interesting here is not only have they incorporated the Department of Juvenile Services into the work that they're doing to fight child trafficking, but they've also incorporated child welfare and some of the other agencies. So for instance, last year in October, Maryland actually amended its laws so that their state child welfare can start to respond to instances of child sex trafficking, even if the abuse is not being carried out by a parent or caretaker. And what's really interesting in this situation is that Turnaround, Inc. actually shares the same building with the local Baltimore CAC. And so they are often able to work together in terms of coordinating emergency response for girls when they're picked up by law enforcement, in terms of administering forensic interviews. And so a really great case of cross-systems collaboration in that jurisdiction as well. Another example of a promising practice in terms of juvenile justice response to child trafficking is the effort undergoing in Los Angeles County. And Los Angeles County has actually done a lot of really great work on this issue. They are, if not the largest, one of the largest counties in the country. And they were actually in the news last week for trying to change their laws to make it more difficult and more expensive for those who wish it to solicit child sex. Last week, the LA County Board of Supervisors, as well as LA County Probation, petitioned to amend the state criminal code in order to increase fines for those who wish to solicit child sex from what's currently $1,000 to $10,000, which would effectively make California the most expensive state in the country to solicit child sex. And so really commendable efforts being taken in Los Angeles County. But again, we want to focus on what's being done in terms of the juvenile justice response here with the collaborative court. And so LA County Juvenile Court developed the Succeed Through Achievement and Resilience program, or the STAR Collaborative Court, in partnership with LA County Probation to really connect youth who were coming in on prostitution charges with services instead of routing them into detention. And so the STAR Court works with the district attorney as well as the Child's Defense Counsel in order to defer prosecution while youth are engaged in treatment. And LA County really endeavors to meet the individual needs of the child wherever possible. For instance, we know that they have service provider partners not only in the county but elsewhere throughout the state of California. And for instance, situations that require increased security precautions and safety precautions, they do have provider partners in remote rural areas outside of the state available as well. And so really they do really try to take in consideration the individual needs of those youths when possible. The court then meets weekly with the youth as well as any family, their service providers, the DA, as well as their defense counsel to monitor and track their progress while they're in treatment. And then ultimately, after successful completion of the treatment program, the court then works to dismiss the prostitution charge. So again, another example of a jurisdiction that is recognizing that child sex trafficking victims are definitely coming into their juvenile justice system, but that is taking innovative and proactive steps to really try and connect those children with services. Moving back towards recommendations, in terms of components of appropriate service delivery for this population, we really feel that appropriate interventions should be both gender responsive as well as trauma informed. Again, because of how much momentum this issue has gained, and particularly the attention recently with the FBI raid, a lot of really concerned and well-meaning individuals and states have come together and really tried to address the issue. And so we often hear, of churches trying to open up beds in their basements, and individuals trying to pull together money to come up with housing and beds. But we really do have to keep in mind the population that we're talking about are severely injured children who have complex trauma, and so there really ought to be a standard of care when we talk about the types of services that they are receiving. And then our last recommendation here, again, we touched on briefly, was the need for a cross-systems approach. We have truly found that some of the jurisdictions that have had the most success in addressing this issue and serving victims have instituted a cross-systems approach in incorporating both collaboration amongst law enforcement, child welfare, the judicial system, NGOs, school systems, as well as the juvenile justice system. And so we think cross-systems collaboration wherever possible is really a really great effort. And so we're going to pause again for some questions here.
Great, thank you, Yasmin. So the first question we have now is related to gangs. Could you talk about gangs that may be changing their focus to human or child trafficking, and what are some implications around that?
Sure. So this is something that we have begun to see. I know in Virginia, outside of DC and Maryland, it's been a particular concern, as well as in California. The reality is, because there is such an increased demand for sex with underage girls and for sex with minors in general, gangs have really started to step in to meet that demand. And so what we are seeing are way more aggressive tactics than we used to see in the past. For instance, we had a number of survivors from LA County Probation actually come visit us in Washington, D.C. earlier this summer for an advocacy training. And what so many of the children noted this time around, and something that I know Malika and I were quite surprised to hear, was that almost more than half of the girls that we talked to had been kidnapped. And so that's something that illustrates just the more aggressive tactics that are being instituted. And I think gang-related trafficking is something that we are definitely seeing more and more. And I think that is exactly what Malika was touching on earlier, about how they've realized that it is in fact more profitable and less risky for them to traffic girls who they unfortunately view as a reusable commodity than, for instance, drugs.
Thank you. So our next question is something that I think a few people have noted in the chat box. Obviously, this presentation is focused on girls, which is a very important and critical population around this issue. Are there other assessment tools that are specific to boys related to this issue?
So I think that is a growing concern. Obviously, our focus is on girls, and what we see as an increased demand for sex with underage girls due to a hypersexualizing culture. But there are definitely boys, and we know that boys are harder to be identified than girls. I don't know of any specific assessment tools aimed solely at boys, but we do know that a number of service providers are endeavoring to kind of expand their services to address this issue amongst boys who are being bought and sold and trafficked. Although from some of our sources and preliminary research, it appears that that type of exploitation manifests itself differently than what we're seeing with girls, which often involve a third-party exploiter. Oftentimes, maybe amongst boys as well as the LGBTQ populations, it's sometimes referred to as survival sex, or the basically trading sexual services for basic necessities such as housing, food, or other services. And so I'm not sure of any specific assessment tools. I know that in Maryland, they were beginning to tweak their current assessment tool to begin to implement it in not just girls' facilities, but boys' facilities as well. But in terms of a specific tool aimed solely at boys, I'm not aware of that at this time.
Okay, thank you. And I think we have time for one more question at this point. And so this question is related to immigration. So could you talk about how girls who aren't U.S. citizens or U.S. residents, what is their situation when they're trafficked? What could the response to that be?
Sure. So as a preliminary matter, I should point out that at Human Rights Project for Girls, we have a strictly domestic focus. And so we solely address issues involving American-born children who've been subject to gendered violence. Of course, this is a phenomenon that affects foreign-born victims, both adult and children, and in terms of sex and labor trafficking. But again, that's not our area of focus. What I will note, however, is one of the big advocacy initiatives that we have had is that for so long, domestic child sex trafficking was floating under the radar. In fact, as Malika mentioned, the main piece of federal legislation on this issue is the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which was initially passed in the year 2000, and it's subsequently been reauthorized a number of times. But just to give you an idea, in 2005, that was the first time that the TVPA even acknowledged that domestic victims could be trafficked. For so long, we thought that trafficking in the U.S. only involved foreign victims who were brought here to be bought and sold, either for labor services or sex services. And so we are newly starting to understand the extent to which this problem is existing amongst our own population. And a lot of the work that we do is trying to fight for parity in funding. So, for instance, in the last several reauthorizations of the TVPA, there has been millions and millions authorized and appropriated for services to fund foreign victims of trafficking, but not any money whatsoever appropriated to serve domestic victims. There have been a couple pilot programs through the Office of Victims of Crime, but really under Health and Human Services is the main agency that serves trafficking victims, and they currently do so under the Office of Refugee Resettlement that doesn't at all even contemplate domestic victims. So whereas it's absolutely an issue and an issue that ought to be addressed, where our focus has been on the domestic piece just because it has floated under the radar for so long. But as my understanding goes, there are services and funding available through the Department of Health and Human Services, Office of Refugee Resettlement, and most of those victims who are foreign-born are to be given essentially the same status and access to services and protections as refugees in the United States.
Great, we appreciate that information. So we'll wrap up the Q&A for now, and I will hand it back over to you, Yasmin, to continue with the presentation.
Sure. And so moving on now to state safe harbor laws, and this is something that I've seen come up in the chat ticker. So touching on the recent FBI operation cross-country, this was the 7th such operation that the FBI, through its Innocence Lost initiative, has undertaken. And most recently, they recovered over 100 child victims of trafficking from over 76 cities in a nationwide sweep. And so we actually started receiving some calls and concerned emails once some of the footage from those raids was released, showing some of these rescued victims in plastic handcuffs. And so in reaching out to some of our partners and colleagues and conducting and basically looking at different media sources, we discovered that in fact some of those child victims could have ended up and did in fact end up behind bars in jurisdictions where there were either a lack of services or legal protections available. So approximately 3/4 of the children rescued as a result of the operation currently live in states where they don't have legal protections from prostitution charges. And for those children who do end up getting charged for juvenile prostitution, they face anywhere up to 2 years in jail and or thousands of dollars in fines. And so there has been a new movement among the states to pass what's being called safe harbor legislation, or laws that basically aim to prohibit minors from being prosecuted for prostitution. The goal of this type of legislation is to really redirect youth victims out of the juvenile justice system and into the child welfare system or other type of agency in order to receive services. We've included some of the states that have enacted this type of legislation here for your review. Most of them have done so through statutory measures, although some have also done so through judicial decisions. Whereas there's no fixed legal definition of safe harbor laws, most of them do possess 3 core components. The first of which is to prevent child victims of sex trafficking from being prosecuted for prostitution. The second, to ensure that coercion is not required in order to prosecute sex trafficking of children. And the third is to protect victims by providing them with specialized services. Current safe harbor laws do vary with respect to a number of issues, for instance, whether or not it's an automatic diversion to services, what the particular age cutoff is. For instance, is it up to age 18? We know that some states it only goes up to 16. Whether or not they create an affirmative defense to a prostitution charge, and whether or not that presumption is rebuttable, the relationship forged between juvenile justice, law enforcement, and other agencies, if any, what types of services the law provides for, and any related funding streams for those services. In addition to safe harbor laws, some states have begun to enact expungement laws, or laws that basically work to clear survivors' records in cases where they can illustrate that past criminal charges were directly related to their exploitation. And now moving on to another issue that we've been getting a lot of questions about lately, not just from state juvenile justice administrators and officials, but also from advocates and service providers in various states. And that's the issue of secure versus non-secure facilities. This issue typically arises in 2 contexts. The first is in instances where judges may recognize girls as victims, however feel that their best alternative to keep the girls safe is to put them behind bars. The other context that we usually see this issue arise is in the case where different residential programs or safe havens want to treat child victims of trafficking but want to do so with locked facilities. Using secure facilities of any sort to quote-unquote protect trafficked and sexually exploited youth, however, can be very problematic and potentially even harmful to those children. So looking at the first scenario, in many states, if and when juvenile court judges do recognize girls as victims, sometimes there are very few alternatives to detention for them. And so we often encounter really well-meaning judges from time to time who indicate that they really think that their only option to keep these girls safe is to keep them behind bars. These judges basically reason that if they let the girls loose, they're vulnerable to being picked up by a pimp who's probably waiting outside the courthouse. If they put them back into foster care or congregate care, they know that those girls are just likely to run. And so in many of those instances, these judges choose to remand the girls to detention in order to keep them safe. So in the juvenile detention context, of course, we know that detention is not safe for girls and that it can serve to further traumatize youth for all the reasons that we've previously discussed. Again, it reinforces their perception of criminality, and in many cases, it can leave youth with a criminal record. But it is important to note that in certain contexts and in certain jurisdictions, court involvement might be the very first opportunity to connect many of these youth with services. In the context of secure residential or treatment facilities, again, it reinforces the perception of criminality, and it can be somewhat of a slippery slope. We often hear survivors asking, well, if I'm a victim, then why am I being held against my will? This approach also ignores the reality that survivors ought to be ready for treatment. Another characteristic of this population is that they run from care, and they run repeatedly, and it makes sense that they would run. These are children who have grown to distrust. Those individuals who were always promised and entrusted to care for them have repeatedly betrayed them, and so it makes sense that they would be skeptical and run from care. Many service provider partners of ours have indicated, however, that when survivors do run, the important thing is that they know that there is a safe place that they can return to when they are, in fact, ready to receive treatment. And what they do find is, though survivors do run, they return for longer and longer increments of time until hopefully they do stay for the duration of the treatment program. But in terms of one of the positives, again, obviously it keeps youth safe from further exploitation and from running away. And I think that the real impetus behind these locked facilities has been some of the instances that we've heard in the news in the last year or so of girls who ran away from treatment facilities who were subsequently raped or killed. And so I think there are good intentions there. However, it can be problematic. Again, many believe, as we do, that secure confinement should not necessarily be an option for abused and exploited youth, especially children who have not committed any crimes. Indeed, many would argue that it is a violation of these children's civil liberties to confine them against their will, even if it's argued that it's in their best interest. However, we do have to note that in many states, few viable alternatives do exist to provide protection and connect these children with services. So moving on now to conclusions and recommendations. Ultimately, we know the reality is child trafficking victims are and will continue to be arrested and adjudicated delinquent for prostitution and other related offenses. And so again, it's absolutely crucial that juvenile justice facilities begin to identify and assess for trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation and begin to implement a trauma-informed approach to service delivery.
So since we really frame this as so much of a call to reform, these are some of the recommendations, and certainly they're not all of the recommendations that we need to pursue in order to change this situation. But here are recommendations that make up, I think, a very significant step towards really changing the paradigm for these girls. It's absolutely critical that we develop and implement in juvenile justice facilities screening and assessment tools for accurate documentation of children at risk who are victims of child trafficking, and that all forms of possible abuse also be identified in order to recognize how sexual and physical abuse can also be indicators of how children are then vulnerable to being subject to trafficking and exploitation. We have to have, in the way that we do service provision for trafficked and exploited youth, we have to have programs that are gender responsive, that are trauma informed, because I think, as we've seen from the last hour that we've spent together, as well as from the expertise of so many who are part of this webinar, that the young folk who come forward with situations of being bought and sold really possess very, very complex trauma, very extensive histories of abuse. And in order for a possibility of healing, we have to be able to have what is comprehensive trauma-informed services for them. And that we need to see collaboration, cooperation between law enforcement, child welfare, juvenile justice, victim service organizations, education system, the judicial system, in order to be able to appropriately, effectively respond to the needs of these girls. And as we talked about earlier, to be able to really forge and advance protocol for law enforcement so that we don't see these girls routed into the juvenile justice system, but instead they're routed to places like children advocacy centers where there's already the expertise in dealing with child sexual abuse. And we do have many examples of CACs who are taking that expertise and really looking at it not only from the place of child sexual abuse, but what happens when that same child has been abused and then propertied through trafficking and exploitation. And some of that good work is being done in Florida and Massachusetts with the CACs. And then train law enforcement judges, juvenile justice personnel, and I think we've mentioned in the chat as well, foster care parents, our schools on the issue of domestic child trafficking and exploitation and how to identify the victims and also be able to allow for the victims to receive services. And here's another piece, and it's part of the reason why we have focused on the issue of children who are domestic victims of trafficking receiving help and services. Because right now, when you look at the federal funding streams for domestic child trafficking victims, we really do not have those federal funding streams. And it's part of the reason why we don't have capacity. It's part of the reason why so often judges will in fact see that the girl in front of the judge is in fact a trafficked girl, but there's nowhere to put the girl. There's no program, there's no treatment center, there's no trauma-informed service for that girl. And so often the judge will put the girl behind bars because it seems as if it's the only safe option for those girls. And so in the work ahead of us, we have to be able to establish diversion programs for trafficked youth so that they are able to receive treatment and healing that is both gender specific, that is trauma informed, instead of being put behind bars. And that we have to advocate for alternatives to at-risk and trafficked youth. We don't feel that detention is an appropriate setting for these girls. Detention often re-traumatizes them, re-victimizes them. And so how can we look at alternatives for girls that are safe, that are trauma-informed? And how do we do that also just for girls who are detained, right? So not only girls who are detained because they have been trafficked or there for reasons related to so-called child prostitution. But at the prevention end, how do we make sure that girls who are running away from abuse are not locked up because all they're doing is trying to cope with their abuse? How do we see those girls as also being victims who need alternatives that are trauma-informed as opposed to detention? And there are certainly more recommendations that we have, but let's go through some questions.
Thank you so much, Malika and Yasmin. In the interest of time, we are going to proceed to wrap up today's webinar. We do really appreciate everyone's active participation and really strong interest in this topic. So we will go ahead and follow up on the questions that you all posed that we didn't have a chance to get to during the webinar today. So we'll send that out separately. So I just want to once again thank Malika and Yasmin so much for sharing your time and expertise today. There's clearly an extraordinary level of interest in this topic, and we really thank you for sharing this information with us. So now I'd like to turn things back over to Linda Rosen with the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention.
Thank you all for joining us today. We have a few things I'd like you to see. There's an evaluation that's going to pop up. Take 5 minutes, please, to complete that online evaluation. We really appreciate your input. I also want you to see what the screenshot looks like of NTTAC's website. In about 2 weeks, I believe, this webinar will be archived, and along with the questions that Angie mentioned, getting those questions out to folks in the participant list, it'll also be posted on our website. The speakers will receive the questions, they'll sort through them, we'll probably have to combine some of them, and then they will answer the questions and post their answers up there. So again, I'd like to thank on behalf of OJJDP, I'd like to thank all of our speakers, our host, the National Training and Technical Assistance Center, and you, our participants, for joining us. I do hope that some of the ideas expressed today will assist you with identification of trafficking victims and an understanding of appropriate support services necessary to prevent further victimization and trauma. You can see there's the contact information for our speakers today, Right for Girls. And we'd also like to hear from you if you have any other ideas about webinars you'd like to see us deliver. We would appreciate hearing your comments. We are thinking about right now an SSDI, a Supportive School Discipline Initiative webinar that talks about trafficking. So that's something that may be coming up in the future. Please stay tuned. Thank you very much.